Thank you. Thank you for the gracious and generous introduction. And before I talk about anything, let's all take a minute and thank our hosts here today for providing this opportunity for us to be together, for providing the generous lunch. So thank you to all of our hosts in this room. And a special shout out to Jill in the very back of the room, pretending that she's invisible, who's been my partner, and I think is a partner to all the speakers, who makes it easy to be able to put together a presentation to be here. So thank you to everybody. And now let's start with a question. It's always good to start with a question. You get to ask me questions later. I get to start with a question for you. So think about it. If somebody came to you and said they knew someone coming from another country to work here in Northern California, what might you tell them they needed to know to work with a group like those of us in the room? Not, all due respect to the CPAs here, nothing about tax codes, nothing about intellectual property, but what would you need to know to be able to engage in the American business community? Anybody have an idea of something you would suggest to somebody? Very fast pace. Prepare yourself for a fast pace. Okay, what else? All right, I've had people say, polish up your English. Know that you need to be on time. So things that we take for granted. But I decided that knowing what we know as Americans about what it takes to engage here might not be as useful to my clients as knowing what other people from other parts of the world had to say. So about 5 years ago, I did a survey, and I asked people who were professionals like us, trade commissioners, consular corps officers, protocol people, what they told their colleagues, citizens who were coming here to work, to invest, to partner with somebody. What 3 things did they tell people from their country that they needed to know to be able to engage here effectively? And I talked to people from, I think, 14 countries, as diverse as South Africa and Canada and Hong Kong and Switzerland. And when I got all done and had this stack of responses, I decided it would be useful to figure out if there was one thing that all this diverse group agreed upon. Was there anything out of all the answers that floated to the top? And you know what? There was. There was. They said, you Americans, you seem pretty friendly, but you know, you don't say what you mean. Americans don't say what they mean. Now, I see some of you nodding and some of you smiling and some of you just looking puzzled. I have to say that I was appalled and shocked. And then I went back to see what that was all about. And when I looked, it didn't have anything to do with our not following a contract or sneaking language into a document once the deal had been agreed to, or not paying our bills. Rather, it came back to 3 phrases that probably are familiar to all of us. Ones we may use before we get back to our cars today. The phrases, I'll give you a call. Let's get together. Let's do lunch. And the trade commissioner from Australia said to me, there is no call, there's no getting together, and there certainly is no lunch. Americans don't say what they mean. But think about it from our perspective. If I say that to you when we're about to leave, it's kind of shorthand, isn't it? Gee, the questions you asked at the end of the presentation were interesting, or your comments were so insightful. It would be terrific to get together and have a chat, wouldn't it? But I know that you've got a business to run, projects to manage, kids' soccer to coach, a family you'd like to see, I know you're busy. So it's a little bit like a pat on the back, maybe a little hug. It says, I like you, but I won't bother you. But for somebody from someplace else, it's an untruthful moment. And that untruthful moment for someone from someplace else around the world is going to be the end of the beginning of a great business relationship. It's a simple misunderstanding. Two cultures, two traditions of how we express ourselves, what we say, and yet miles apart. So another question is, how do you bridge that gap? How do you know what might be similar or different in how someone from another place thinks it's appropriate to do business, to communicate, to manage their time? So at that question, usually people go, oh God, she's going to give us some case studies to read, and we're going to have to analyze them and discuss. Or she's going to pull out a stack of books, and we're going to have to read them. We're not going to do either of those things. You can relax. Good news, right? But what we're going to do is look at a broad picture of how you can have some idea of what might be similar or different for people from one country or another. And we're going to look at the work of a man named Richard Lewis, and you can find his books on Amazon. And he is a businessman, an interculturalist, a linguist, a researcher. And as he worked and consulted around the world, he developed an idea that there really were three very different cultural groups in the world. And that if you understood something about the characteristics of each group, and you knew what countries the groups might fit into, what did I just say? If you knew what groups countries might fall into, then you'd have an idea of how business might be similar or different. Seems reasonable. So, because he made this up out of his research, he got to name the cultures, the groups. So you can tell right away, there might be some similarity. So what I'm going to do is tell you the characteristics, a couple characteristics of each group, and ask you to tell me a country whose culture might reflect what we're talking about in that group. And let's start at the bottom with the reactives. So, long-term planners, business and social lives connected, subtle and indirect communicators. They're likely to respond, and silence is part of their pattern of communication. So what country might fall into this group? Anybody? Asia. Okay. All right. So let's move up a step to the multi-active. Right away you have an idea there's something different going on here. So exuberant emotional communicators. Planners, but very flexible. They change their plans. Business and social lives woven together. So somebody, what country might this be? Shout out. Italy, some European, but more South America, Brazil, Mexico. Okay. And then the linear actives, all about time and task, schedules, getting things done, organized planners, business and social generally separated, and very direct communicators. Americans. All right. So when I first read about this, sir.
You said we weren't.
Said you weren't?
Let's have lunch.
Well,
Let's get together. How does that tie in?
that's a communication that is, the words say something, how we use them in that context is more subtle. But we'll talk about it a little bit more as we go through the program about the difference. So, and I think this is a really good point to make that what we're going to talk about today are pretty big, broad generalities to give you an idea, a foundation to think about. But we're always going to find exceptions to what we talk about, just trying to set a framework to give you an idea. So that's a really good point, and nobody in all the workshops I've done has ever brought that up. So thank you very much. All right. So originally when I read about his work, I thought this is easy. You have 3 groups, so you pull out your Excel spreadsheet and you take the list of 200 countries in the world and you just dump them into the appropriate columns and you're good to go. But as all things that we wish for don't come out exactly as we expect, and this is one of them. Uh-oh. All right. So Mr. Lewis said that while some countries, like Brazil, are absolutely multi-active, and if you put them on this triangle so somebody could understand that, you'd put them right up at the top. But a country like India, their culture is actually a blend between multi-active and reactive. So if you were going to identify their culture by where they sat on the triangle, you'd put them in the middle of that line. So now you have your very own triangle, and now you actually have a project. You didn't think that you were going to have to do anything, did you? I'm going to ask you, on the front of the page is a nice pretty triangle like this, and on the reverse are the cultural groups with a little more extensive list of the characteristics. I'm going to ask you to locate on this triangle where you think 8 different countries, and I'm going to give you a list, 8 countries belong if you were representing what their culture was. You with me so far? Okay, so here are the countries. The NAFTA countries, US, Mexico, Canada, and then the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So we're going to take about 3 minutes, I can see the clock, about 3 minutes to let you put the countries where they belong, according to your experience, your impressions of those 8 countries. Now you can do this independently, you can do this as a group, you can talk to your neighbors. I'm going to leave this up so you don't have to worry about making a list. And in 2 or 3 minutes we'll come back together and then we'll see where Mr. Lewis put them on his triangle. And we're not collecting the papers, so you're safe. No grading today. All right, I can see that some of you have already completed your task, and for those of you who haven't yet, stay with us and you can finish up. So let's take a look at Mr. Lewis's triangle. It's a rainbow. It's a rainbow. So take a look. Can you see from there? And some of you I know are going to want the rainbow. So if at the end of the program you'll give me your business card with a triangle on it, I'll email it to you. So can you see? Think about the countries trying to work together. Here's the US, Canada, Mexico up there. But the BRICS, I think, are a really interesting group because the cultures are so different. If we start with Brazil at the top, we come to Russia a little bit down here, just toward multi-active. India across the way, China down here, and back over here for South Africa. So once you look at the characteristics and you realize how different their approaches could be, you begin to understand some of the challenges that people and countries have in working together if you don't know in advance to expect things to be different. But we don't really work with countries, do we? We work with people from countries. So it's useful to remember that while for each individual, your home culture, the traditions of where you were raised, are a foundation for your culture, that each individual is also influenced by their family, their religion, where they went to school, where they've lived, where they worked, the type of work they do, and whatever that little special thing is that makes each one of us an individual. So as we go forward, when I talk about people in Brazil are all emotional, energetic communicators, and you say, I have a friend from Brazil and she's the quietest person I ever met in my life, it's true. But today we're going to stick with some of those big picture generalities to start to give us an idea about where those similarities or differences might be. Because really, the reason to know all of this is because the foundation, the key to doing business globally, whether you're local or getting on a plane all the time, are the relationships we build with people. No relationship, likely no business. So the more we know about each other, the better we can be at building the relationships. And that takes us back, of course, to another question. So one of the big questions in the world is, who am I? What's my place in the world? Probably not something you've thought about since you took a college philosophy class. But this question gets answered in different ways. One way that might be familiar to us living in an American business, very linear, active culture is, I am me, special and unique. I am an individual. I think for myself, I make my own decisions, I develop my capabilities. I am me, special and unique. You know, we teach our children to think for themselves, to have an opinion when they're little. We ask them, do you want frosted flakes or oatmeal for breakfast? You probably don't have to ask your children anymore those questions. We start to teach them that they should think about things and have an opinion. The individual is the building block of the American society. And it shows up in what? We create and unique. And yet, for our multi-active and reactive colleagues, the answer may be more likely, I am part of a group. And my first concern is the welfare and the benefit of my group, which sometimes leads the linear, active business people to complain that you can never get a decision made because those people always have to have a conversation, build a consensus, and be sure that the group agrees to what we're going to do. They, in contrast, can complain about those Americans, those Germans, those other linear actives, are impatient, impetuous, and difficult, always rushing ahead. Am I first an independent actor or first a member of a group? But if that seems to be a stretch to understand and can cause some challenges in the workplace, I think some of the major challenges come around this idea of time. So what are some of our expressions about time? Yes, amen. I think you got a lot of people nodding. What else do we say about time? Time is money. We talk about shaving time off a schedule, banking time, losing time, finding time. It's a, sir? Making time, like it was three-dimensional like this clicker. But time's really a concept, isn't it? And especially for linear actives, it is scarce and fleeting. It's as if we all walked around clutching a small hourglass in our hand, checking to see how we'd be. So I do this. When I look at this slide now, I think of about 6 weeks ago, I did a presentation to a group of CEOs. And when I walked into the conference room, there in the middle of the table was an hourglass about this time. And I thought my slide came to life. And they used it to time the presentations that they each made. I've never seen that. I thought, oh, I need a picture of this. Time as fleeting and limited. That is the linear active focused on time and task. And yet we find ourselves working with our colleagues, multi-actives, reactive, for whom time is abundant and ongoing, like this river. And I asked in a workshop in South Africa if there was a local saying, traditional saying about time. And one woman in the back held up her hand and she said, well, we traditionally say if the sun is up, there's plenty of time. So think about that as a contrast to that person walking around with that hourglass in their hand. And if I saw what when those two ideas about time come up against each other without anyone having some understanding, it's not a pretty picture. Imagine that you'd been with me about now maybe 10 years ago in Mexico City at a conference with a client. And you know how it is at a conference, you end up in the hotel lobby, people going through, coming back and forth. And I looked up and there was a guy coming toward me. And if you'd been with me, you would have seen that the closer he got, the faster he walked, and his face became as bright as this jacket that I'm wearing. And the first words to me were, Lainey, these people are impossible. And I thought, this is not a really good beginning. And he went on to tell me in a rather agitated way that he'd been there for 3 days. Every meeting, the people he met with had been late. He'd never felt so disrespected in his life. And that the worst was the people he just met with who kept him waiting for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And he sort of stomped his foot and said, I will never work with these people. And off he went to explain to somebody else how badly he'd been treated. Well, I thought somebody didn't do their homework and do some research to understand about where they were thinking about working. And as those things happened at a conference, I ran into those people who kept him waiting for 20 minutes. And they said to me, Lainey, what's with that guy? Now, what was I going to say? I just listened. Oh, was there a problem? And they said, well, we were running a little long finishing a meeting. And you know, we couldn't just walk out. We had to bring the meeting to a natural, reasonable conclusion. So we greeted him. We explained we'd be just a few minutes. We gave him an office, a computer with internet access, coffee, bottled water, English language magazines and newspapers, everything we could think of to make him comfortable. And we hurried, and we were only 20 minutes late. But it was clear. He was already done with us before we started. And we were disappointed because we had an intention of hiring him to do a new project. 2 misunderstandings about what it means to be on time. In that instance, killed a deal. You have to have some understanding about how people feel about time, how they organize their life, and what their priority is. Is it task and be on track, or is it people and relationships? 2 very different approaches. Oh, yes, but then there's some things about time that aren't so philosophical. There's some things when you're working globally that are just plain practical. Okay, month and day here, folks. What's the month and what's the date? April, yeah. Yeah, it's either October 4th or April 11th. But if you just... Right, okay. Well, and you passed. I'm so impressed. Some woman in a workshop said to me, "Oh, I don't know what big deal is. You know, my friends in Europe think my birthday was in April and my birthday's really in November, but I get a lot of birthday cards. I have birthdays twice a year. I really like it." Good for you, but if you're worrying about when somebody's going to show up for a meeting or when you're supposed to be there, it's kind of good to be more precise. So I always recommend you write out the day of the month. But there's an even trickier thing with time. If I told you that the project needed to be on my desk on the Friday before Halloween, it would not take you more than 30 seconds to whip out your phone, look at October on your calendar and say, okay, that's the 28th this year, right? And we'd be good. But if you tell somebody in Chile or Cambodia that the project's due the day before, the Friday before Halloween, it just means they have to pull out their phone and do a Google search. You know, make it easy for people. We very casually, and I think this is true of people everywhere. One woman told me that her client told her that they couldn't do anything before Whitsunday. Anybody have an idea about when Whitsunday is? I had to look it up 3 times. 7th Sunday after Easter. So if you live there, you know. So one thing to think about with time is to be careful about those casual references. And then there's the matter of being nice to people. Remembering that not everybody is on the same time zone as you are. That I belong to an organization and our board is composed of people from different countries. So when our board meeting is at 11 o'clock on a Thursday here, for me, I'm thinking about lunch. My colleagues in Toronto and DC and Atlanta, they're thinking about an afternoon snack. But our colleague in South Africa has just poured her first glass of wine before dinner. And our colleague in New Zealand, she brushed her teeth and poured herself a cup of coffee because it's 6 in the morning for her. So it's fine for us, we're a volunteer organization, everybody signed up for the hours. But if this is a business activity, make sure that you're thoughtful about not asking the same person to always be the one who's up at midnight or 3 a.m. or 6 in the morning. Share the pain. Time is tricky, and I think it is one of the most challenging aspects of working globally. But sometimes you actually get to go or they arrive. And so then you get to connect in a different way with these people that you've been scheduling things via email, and you get to greet them. So we're going to talk a little bit about greetings. I call it greeting rituals. So anybody know something about the history of a handshake? No? Okay, I'll tell you in a second. But Jeff volunteered to volunteer when I asked him if he would volunteer, and he was nice enough to say yes. So we're going to talk about handshakes, because handshakes are the most common physical greeting in a business situation, right? And you've probably shaken hands with people today, and you'd be hard-pressed to remember who it was, because it's so automatic. But a handshake is actually an answer to a question. Really, it's an answer to a question. So if you go back to the days of the knights in shining armor, when they'd come together, they'd take off their armor, they'd put down their swords, and there was still a question in their minds. Anybody think about what that might be?
Are you still going to stab me?
Where's the knife?
Yeah, in essence, exactly. Am I safe here? Where's the knife? So the original handshake I need your arm,
Sure.
was like this. Now, how does that answer the handshake, the question? It's because then you're checking for a hidden weapon. It's there. Yeah, okay? Now, that's not a question that we think about when we come here or go most places that we go. We're very fortunate that that's not an issue for us. But there is an issue that is equally pressing for us, and that is, are you paying attention to me? Are you happy to engage with me? Are you glad that we're going to do a project together? Are you just happy to make my acquaintance? You want to be able to answer that question in the affirmative. Yes, I am. And that is your handshake. Your handshake needs to be firm enough so that you know that you've made a connection, but not so firm as to make anybody cry. So everybody get up, or even win. Or even wins. Very good, Pam. Yes, no flinching. So go shake hands with a couple of people. This is not that one.
You do all the shaking while you just get my hand or you brush your head.
Workshops at the same time.
Okay, so one thing you want to do, I recommend, you may not want to, but I suggest that before you go to a new place, new country, or you have a visitor coming, that you do a little research and find out what those initial greeting rituals are. So what happens, we talk about a handshake that is nice and firm, right? But what happens, think about the times you got a handshake that was kind of limp. So what do you think? Oh, yuck. Not much personality. But you might want to do some research because in parts of the world, a handshake is a little softer. Yes, sir.
Does that also apply to phrases that you might say verbally?
Yes, there are different forms of greeting rituals, words that you say, depending on where you are. Exactly. Good point.
Thank you.
But what happens when the handshake is unexpected?
And lengthy.
Jeff knows what you're doing. That's a really good point.
She wiggled out of it.
So you wiggle out of it, but more common, and Jeff was really good because he knew something was going on, is this is what happens. So the person who expects to have the long handshake, they're likely to follow you. They're not done. And what's the message then? The message is not, gee, I'm glad to work with you. It's, I'd like to get away. So which is another reason to know what might be coming. But I just want to add one thing that you'll see. I would predict that the next time you go to a Chamber of Commerce event, industry function, a big networking event, you'll see this. And you definitely do not want to be the person that this picture is posted on Facebook. How many times have you seen that? I wonder if someone more interesting is over there. So, handshakes can be tricky. Thank you. Let's give him a... Just one other thing about handshakes is it's important also to realize that for some people, touching a person of the opposite sex who's not part of your immediate family is forbidden. So you want to think about that not just as you travel, but at events that you are in here, or if someone seems to be reluctant to not press the issue because you may not know. I had a client who was going to Saudi Arabia to make a presentation, and we talked about a number of things, including that if he was meeting a woman, to let her extend her hand first. If it was okay for her to shake hands, she would indicate it. And when he came back, he talked about what a great time and how everybody loved his talk, which is great. And he said a woman was assigned to orient him to the conference and all the things he needed as a speaker. He said his first instinct was, of course, to extend his hand. He said, I could hear you in my ear saying, don't do that, don't do that. And he said, I was glad I listened because she never extended her hand and it was very smooth. So just a little asterisk to remember. Yes, sir.
I remember a situation, I think with in Arabic culture, where if there's a man and a woman, you're supposed to greet the man first and then the woman. But here in the U.S., we're like ladies first, and they see it. They see it. They take it the wrong way.
No, it's their way.
Right.
Yeah, right, it's not, you're right, it's different.
But I think you make an important point in the phrasing, because for every culture, what's not your own seems strange and wrong. It's a normal human reaction, and that is something that exists for everybody around the world, and that's one of the challenges of finding ways to work together. So that's why you do some research before you go, right? So you're prepared for that kind of thing. And then there's a matter of actually talking to each other. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I need to show you.
Come.
In my whole life, I do sales marketing. There is only one lady I shake hand with before, and she did this to me.
Oh.
She did it straightforward.
That's
She didn't help me. She just do this when I'm doing the handshake with her,
and
and she didn't grab anything. She just do this.
so how does that feel?
I feel she's cold. I was interviewing like 10 rep firms in Las Vegas. There is a hotel suite. And she's accompanied with her husband. Her husband is the president of the rep firm. And she's the wife next to him. His husband is really nice, gentle, and nice handshake. When he do the handshake, he look at me, firmly. But here comes the wife. She did this to me. So I kind of, interesting. So when I got home, I checked on the dictionary, Google, and I feel like, is that she meant to say to me, I don't know you yet, or something. She's kind of really cool and cold when she's doing the handshake with me.
It's hard to know what it is. Maybe she simply doesn't like,
We
doesn't, no. I hadn't thought about going down that path. But she may not be comfortable shaking hands. But it really illustrates what we're talking about is the handshake is a message, and you really need to think about the message that you're sending. So thank you very much for bringing that up.
Thank you.
So, tricky business, that casual handshake. But you want to be sure always that you're thoughtful about the message that you're sending. And it isn't easy to send a message with a handshake always, but certainly when you're talking, and you have to remember that English is not everyone's first language, and that is simply one of the complications of working with people from around the world. But more so might be that there are different styles of communicating. Yes, sir.
How do you avoid overthinking the issue? For example, so a guy goes to somewhere where the woman should offer to shake hands so that she feels comfortable, but she's read up on him and says, this guy's not very friendly, he's not offering to shake my hand. How do you get those?
Holy cow.
It's such a good question. It's such a good question because then you do find times where everybody is deferring a little bit. But I think it becomes quickly obvious, and that people then find their way. But there are more people who don't pay attention than there are who do. So it does happen sometimes, but not very often. So there is no magic answer to that, except to kind of get the idea of what's happening. And be pleased that you did some research so that you know and are prepared. So,
I think there might be a magic answer.
okay,
I
I love magic
apologize,
answers.
it just
No,
came
this
to
is good.
I think a smile solves lots of questions and problems. Don't you?
I hate to disagree with you.
Is
but-
that not right?
It depends. It's like everything we talk about today, it depends. It depends on where you are. So a Russian girl told me that her mother told her, do not smile at strangers. You don't know those people, you don't need to smile at them, you don't have a connection to them. And some of my French friends say, when people smile all the time, we have a saying. They're either crazy or they're Americans. They're either crazy or they're Americans. So I don't mean to be disrespectful of
No, I appreciate
your
that.
answer.
That's good to know.
But
Yeah.
that is one, and for me, it's crazy making because I'm excited wherever I am. I want to smile at everybody. It's so interesting. I'm excited. And then I hear Michelle saying, crazy, crazy. But I think it comes, especially in countries with really difficult histories where people were not welcoming to each other, that there is a sense of privacy that you need to keep, a distance from other people unless you know them. And in that, the casual smile is not necessarily welcome. So it's one of the more challenging parts for people like me who want to smile at everybody. Happy down here. Yes, sir.
As long as we're on this topic, what about men and women situations? Because there's some cultures where if a woman smiles at him, he thinks he's being asked for a date. And
Indeed.
there's other cultures where if a woman doesn't smile at him, she's really unfriendly and cold and what a bitch.
Yep.
So, I mean, sorry about the language, but I'm just trying to get the extremes out.
Yep, it is true.
How do
Both
you
those
handle
things.
that?
Well, one of the things is you do some research before you go someplace so you behave in what's perceived. Let's call it as a perceived in that environment and that tradition as being appropriate. And so if you're a woman and I travel with college students, okay? It's a whole other life. But getting the girls to understand that what you wear here, what you wear in LA especially, out in the evening, little short dresses, little low dresses, in LA would be a non-event, and in Italy is an invitation. Getting people to get their heads around those differences is not easy. So you have to look before you go. Can I ask you to hold that? I just want to make a couple of points and then I'll come back to you. Is that all right? Okay, I just want to touch on the differences in styles of communication between our three groups. Linear actives are known as very direct, although sometimes a little politically correct, but very direct. An answer, a yes or no, is just that, a yes or no answer. Let's move on, say what you mean, tell us. And we're all about data and facts. It's as if we are shooting arrows of information at you. It's tell me what I need to know, tell me now, get to the bottom line, just answer the question and don't beat around the bush. Yet, for our multi-active and reactive colleagues, the message might be wrapped up like a little gift in a box that you have to unwrap. So I work with a French woman who I've mentioned before, and I would send her a schedule for a visit with all these students, and I'd call and say, how's it look? And she'd say, looks pretty good. And then she'd say, but are you sure we should see Bruno Tuesday, and are you sure we should see Chicken Friday night? And when I was newly working with her, I would give her all those little arrows of data and facts about why those were excellent choices. And then she'd say to me, okay, if you're sure. And then my hair would stand on end because I'm thinking, I just told you I'm sure. And then we'd do as I scheduled. And after a few times, I noticed sometimes whatever I'd scheduled that she had questioned, it didn't work so well. And I began to understand that really what she was saying to me in that little pretty box, are you sure, was bad idea. Really bad. And once I could translate that in my head, my response to are you sure became, could you tell me what I'm missing? And then she'd tell me, and then we could fix it. But her first concern was not to insult me, not to appear rude, not to directly tell me I was making a mistake. So I learned that when I'm working with people from multi-active or reactive cultures, I need to think about how I listen. That I need to listen for clues. You know, linear actives listen for data and facts and dates. But otherwise, you listen for information and hints. It's not always about thinking about how you present your idea, being sure that you don't put somebody in an uncomfortable situation where they would feel that their answer wasn't comfortable for you to hear. But it also requires us to extend our listening for those hints for when a question, are you sure, can really be a statement. Yes, sir.
So, asking people in a situation like that, straightforward, in a situation like that, is this exactly, are we on the same page? I mean, there's a difference, no offense, like California versus New York. California people don't want to hurt your feelings and you have to read in between the lines. I've dealt with people in Japan, for example, where no doesn't always mean no. No means maybe, yes means I don't know, and yes doesn't always mean yes.
Exactly.
And no offense, but it's just a difference between men and women. You ask a woman what's wrong, she says nothing. Guys walk away and say, hey, she's okay. And it's like, no, she's got all these issues. I'm just saying.
Just saying. But you know, it's exactly what I'm talking about. And that is one of the big challenges. But once you get your head around the idea that there is a different style, you can start to hear the different messaging, and you can also talk to each other about it. You know, the Frenchman and the Englishman had a meeting, and the American did what they always do, was recap the meeting and send a list of bullet points, who's doing what, this is what we agreed to, right? That's what you do. And then he sent it to his French colleague, who first of all read it looking for some hidden message. He said, I know all this stuff, so if he wrote to me, he's telling me something, but I can't get it out of this no matter what I do. So he called the American and said, okay, what are you telling me that I don't get? And he said, I'm just recapping the meeting. And the Frenchman said, don't do that. I know what we said, I know what I'm supposed to do, I'm fine, and don't send me this kind of stuff anymore. You know, he was insulted. But he was first looking for a hidden message. So you need to understand it in that kind of situation. You can work out, I need to do this because I need it in the file, or whatever the answer is. But it begins with being aware of what the differences might be. You had a question, I promised you.
Is it sometimes that you say something that's maybe a cliche or a normal American phrase that could insult somebody of another country? I had a situation where I used the term, here's looking at you.
Interesting.
And that was to an Englishman who became very insulted.
Really?
Because in Old English, they used to make beer steins with glass bottoms. So you would say, here's looking at you as you drank the beer to make sure you're not going to get stabbed by the person that you're looking through the bottom of the beer mug. And he interpreted that to mean, are you trying to tell me that you're going to stab me?
Oh,
And I
how
didn't realize
interesting.
that.
How interesting.
So you gotta watch what we say in terms of what we think are normal phrases.
Indeed. Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm going to borrow your story.
It actually happened.
I believe you. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So communication is tricky, and you just gave me a good lead into where we're going next. So I thank you for that. If talking is complicated, using our devices to communicate is more complicated. So how many of you, I just want to ask a random question, how many of you are texting more for business? No.
Okay. Yeah,
Email.
the last group I had about half the people were starting to text all the time, so.
It must have been
But-
younger.
It was a mix like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so email can be challenging. So we have a group with a lot of experience in this room. Tell me one or two things that are worth considering. Imagine that you're sharing and talking to a new staff person who's starting to write their emails that are going to go around the world. What would you tell them was important to know to write a useful, clear email? Okay, yes, sir.
These kids, they start off with, hey.
So should they change that?
Oh, God, yeah.
Okay, so can I translate to that mean a formal salutation and closing, right? Okay,
Hello.
what else?
Hello.
Subject, a clear subject. Anybody else? Avoid abbreviations.
And you is spelled Y-O-U, not you.
There's that too. Lose the sports references. Unless you know that the person at the other end of the line is also a Warriors fan, and then it's okay. Avoid sports references, abbreviations, use short sentences. Some people like to use bullet points, a clear subject line. And the other thing I would say is warm it up. Email is essentially a cold medium of communication. Remember, what we're talking about here is not just knowing about how to communicate better, to just move things along. What we're trying to do is build a relationship with the person at the other end of the line. So warm it up means if you know something about them, you can ask. You know, how are the kids' soccer? Did you go on vacation? If you know something about what's happening where they are, is their election upcoming? Was there a flood? Something that says, I recognize there's a real person at the other end of the line. So that it feels a little more like you're relating to them and respecting them. Had a woman in a workshop say, oh, now I understand all those weird emails from Brazil. I always want to know what I'm doing. Warm it up, keep it clear, keep it simple, language simple. This isn't the place to show off your vocabulary. And don't be afraid to pick up an old traditional instrument and make a phone call, especially if you're delivering bad news. But sometimes it's fun if you're delivering good news. And sometimes if you're not getting an answer to something that you think they're avoiding you, sometimes a phone call can help sort it out because maybe there's something they don't really want to write, but they'll tell you. So don't be afraid of this instrument to use in the traditional old-fashioned way. And then I would like to suggest that there is another traditional way to build a relationship that works when you're fortunate enough to be in the same place together, and that is sharing a meal. There is something really powerful about a shared meal and in building a relationship. And you may not think that these two very different people, Secretary Clinton and Prime Minister Churchill, would share that idea, but both of them were advocates in their time of the shared meal as a way to build a relationship, to gather information. Winston Churchill was famous. There's a book about Churchill's dinners, for using dinner to get intelligence that he wanted from people. And Secretary Clinton talked about it as a way to show your culture and to say things that you couldn't say in a regular meeting. But really, the thing that taught me this lesson of the importance of a shared meal was a trade commissioner in Barcelona who said to me, if you just tell your clients to take the time to have a proper lunch, they do a lot more business than grabbing a sandwich and talking about a contract. A shared meal is a powerful relationship building tool. And when the visitors come here, think about food from home. Now, there's no one in this room who is going to think automatically about taking someone from someplace else to McDonald's. I know that. We're about local, farm-raised, fine dining. But I was working on a conference in LA, and some of the speakers were coming in to check their PowerPoints and get ready for the next day. And a couple came up and said to me, "We just flew in from Delhi and we're hungry. Is there any McDonald's nearby?" And I thought, I'm in downtown LA, there is, but really? And they said, "We just want some food from home." And I thought, oh, that's weird. And then I thought, oh yeah, I remember standing in the airport in Delhi in the middle of the night, seeing McDonald's, thinking, okay, food from home. It's what is familiar to you. So sometimes for our visitors, it's kind not to take them to our best new restaurant, but rather to take them to someplace where the food is familiar, the tools for eating are familiar, where they can be at ease and relaxed. So food, shared meals can be a terrific bonding experience for building those relationships with people from all over the world. And I hope that as you go forward and as we end this, when you come across one of those moments that is frustrating, annoying, makes your hair stand on end, that you'll take a minute and ask yourself, is this something that has to do with culture and tradition? Something that maybe I don't understand and the other person doesn't understand either. And that you'll think about what you know and what you've learned, and that you'll find a way to bridge the differences and build a really powerful relationship. So I want to thank you all for sharing this time with me, and I'll be around if you want to have some conversations, some questions afterwards, but I'm going to turn it back over to our host.